Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by Afro FM and Chris Meade of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.
Hello, welcome to Real Talk USA. This is Kiram and
Chris Meade. I'm
yeah.
here again. Yeah, good to see you again, Kiram. How are you doing?
Good, I'm doing good. Today we're talking about
a tough subject today, child abduction. And we have with us today Jennifer Harkins, who's with the Office of Children's Issues for the Hague Abduction Convention. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hey, how are you doing today?
Pretty good.
Good. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and why you're here in Ethiopia?
Sure. So I'm a country officer in the Office of Children's Issues. Our office is the central authority for the Hague Abduction Convention. And my purpose here in Ethiopia is kind of to talk about the convention and to talk about the issue of international parental child abduction in kind of a larger context. To see how, what opportunities we might have in working with Ethiopia to try and resolve cases that may come up in the future.
And I understand you were also, some of your meetings have been with the African Union as well.
Yes.
And you met with them yesterday?
Yeah, so we met with some of them yesterday. They had a conference they were in the middle of regarding child protection, and so we met with them to kind of talk about their interest in the Hague Abduction Convention and how they might be able to promote it across the continent to all the African countries.
So what is the Hague Abduction Convention?
So the Hague Convention is it's an international treaty. It provides a civil remedy for parents who are seeking the return of their child who may have been taken across international borders by the other parent without their consent. And so the treaty, it focuses on securing the prompt return of the child to their country of habitual residence where they were residing, because under the treaty it is thought to be that is the appropriate jurisdiction for hearing a custody case. So the treaty itself is not determining custody, it's just determining the jurisdiction of where custody should be determined.
How common is international child abduction?
It's very common, actually. The United States sees probably more than 1,000 cases a year into and out of the U.S. And there are more children abducted into and out of the United States than any other country in the world. So we see the largest amount of these cases in my office. But these cases happen all over the world, between all different countries, of all different, socioeconomic backgrounds. It's not specifically a Western thing or anything of that nature. It's really, it's just families that are, kind of being separated, by a decision unilaterally made by one parent. And so the convention works to try to resolve these cases in a prompt manner because the issues dealing with children are generally urgent because, before you know it, the children aren't children anymore and they've, spent their entire childhood without access to one of their parents.
Is there any reason why the United States is the most common country for children to be abducted or?
I think, it's probably a variety of reasons is that, there's a lot of immigrants to and from the United States, a lot of business occurring to and from the United States. So there's a lot of movement of people. And I think as the world continues to develop and globalization becomes more prevalent, people are going to continue to move internationally more and more, either for short term, for vacation or for work as well as just to be living abroad in different countries. And so once you get people who are living in separate countries that have different legal structures, these cases kind of tend to crop up because it's not as clear-cut as how you're going to resolve them because you're not living all in the same jurisdiction.
Do you have any sort of personal experience? Like, do you work any particular? Like, do you work on individual cases, or are you like an advocate for policy changes?
I do both. So everyone in my office works on casework as well as on bilateral engagement with countries. For me, right now, I work on sub-Saharan Africa, as well as India and the subcontinent. So I handle probably more than 50 countries at the moment. And in a lot of those countries, we do have cases, and we work with parents to try to provide them with resources and information to help them resolve their cases in the case of non-convention countries. And then on the flip side, in convention countries, we assist them in processing their Hague applications and sending them on to the central authority of the country the child was taken to, and continuing to follow up with them to try and assist them in pursuing the return of their child through the convention.
How many countries in the world are convention countries, and how many are not?
I believe right now there's almost 100 convention countries. The United States isn't partnered with every country. We go through a partnership review process. And so I believe the United States is partnered with maybe just shy of 80 countries on that list.
Is there a reason? What goes into the partnership review? Do you know?
So it's basically a way for us to evaluate whether or not a country would be a good partner under the convention if they have the appropriate processes and institutions to handle cases. And so the United States takes the reservation to review every country before they determine if they're going to partner with them or not. So some of those countries that we're not yet partnered with, we're in the process of reviewing them. And hopefully the rest of them will review in the future.
Maybe you don't know. What goes into making a good partnering country? What are some of the factors? Do you know?
So generally, some of the things we're looking at are: do they have a central authority, basically an office that is established to handle cases, some point of contact for us to be able to reach out to submit applications. If they have a court system that can handle hearing cases, as well as whether or not they have implementing legislation, whether or not they have the laws in place to handle implementing the convention in a proper way.
Is this not more of a cultural or traditional issue than policy? I think it's more of a tradition or culture of a particular society.
I mean, we don't see it that way, no. We evaluate countries for partnership on the same criteria, across the board. So, I mean, I think some countries have a hard time understanding the convention, especially countries that haven't yet joined. They have a hard time understanding how a parent could abduct a child. And so there's that cultural gap, because especially in the African context, the idea of family is different than in the very Western concept. And so it's more difficult for them to understand these issues. But that's not to say it's impossible. It seems to me that we can come to an agreement on how these cases are handled.
So international parental child abduction is defined as the wrongful removal or retention of a child outside their country, in breach of another parent or guardian's custody rights. Mm-hmm. So can you explain a little bit about, a child, right? A child it's not property, right? A child is a child of two parents. Mm. So how can it be that one parent has rights that the other one doesn't have? What is a breach of the other parent's right?
So, I mean, essentially, barring any kind of custody order, I should say in the United States, it's generally understood that both parents should have custodial rights to the child. They have the right to at the very least visit with the child and have access to the child. and that it's also in the interest of the child to have access to both parents. So it's not always about the rights of the parents, but also the rights of the child to have access to both of their parents, if it's deemed to be a safe and secure environment that they're having such access to their parents. And so I understand. Yeah, I mean, a child is not property, but a child doesn't always have the voice themselves to speak up in these types of situations and demand their right to have access to both parents. And so that's what the convention is trying to make sure that at the very least that a court is reviewing cases to determine where custody should be had, and then the custody court is determining whether or not the child should have access to both parents.
Real Talk USA.
Is there a particular age that's more common for a child to be abducted? I suspect they're mostly younger kids.
I'm not sure what the statistics are on that. As far as the Hague Abduction Convention goes, a parent can only file an application for a child who is under the age of 16. At the age of 16, they can no longer file an application under the Hague Convention, even though in many countries, including the United States, a child is considered a child until they're older than 16. In the U.S., it's 18.
But I guess it's assumed that roughly 16, somebody can voice whether they want to live with this person or not.
Yeah, I assume so. I'm not sure. It's the way the convention is written. It's very explicit in saying that it's only for children who are under 16.
Can you describe a little bit about how countries work together to resolve cases of international parental child abduction?
Countries generally, if they're convention partners, they generally will use the convention as a means to try and resolve cases. In non-convention countries can still work together, but it's a bit more difficult because there's no framework that's established in order to resolve these cases. So a lot of times the countries will have to try to come to some sort of understanding on the issue and potentially a way to resolve it. And it's not very common to see countries working very closely together to resolve these types of cases outside of the context of the convention.
I can imagine it gets pretty messy.
Yeah, it definitely can.
Do countries, even if they're a part of the convention, do you find that countries will take the side of their national?
It does happen sometimes. The United States, tries to discourage that because despite the nationality of either of the parents, the child should still have the right to be with both of their parents. But it definitely does happen.
So why might a parent need the convention if they already have a custody order? Maybe you can, what is a custody order? Let's start there. Let's be very basic.
Sure. So a custody order is an order issued by a court that has jurisdiction over custody of a child. And so it's basically determining, especially in cases of parents being divorced, it's determining who is going to have the child and for what amounts of time, who can make decisions for the child, and how that may affect the other parent's rights to do the same. And so, a parent who already has a custody order, they still do need the convention because, for example, if it's a U.S. custody order, the U.S. custody order is not automatically enforceable in other countries because countries are sovereign states. They have their own, judiciary and law enforcement that the United States does not have control over. And so even though they have a U.S. custody order, it's basically like having a piece of paper from the United States government, but other countries may not want to enforce that order because it was not issued by their courts. And so they also, they want to, they would want to work through the convention as well because it establishes, a framework for how these cases can be resolved. There's a standard procedure for how cases are processed, which courts can hear cases, and as well as exceptions to the child being returned to their country of habitual residence. Just because a child was living in another country does not necessarily, the convention does not automatically mean that the child will return to that country. There are, many articles in the convention that stipulate circumstances where that can be, kind of overruled, and the court can cite those different articles in the convention to order that the child remain in the country where they were taken to.
So what kinds of cases fall under the Hague Abduction Convention?
Cases under the convention are cases where a parent can reasonably demonstrate that the child was living in a different country, that they were abducted from one convention country to another convention country. They also need to be able to provide evidence the removal of the child was in violation of the left behind parent's custodial rights, and that the parent was exercising their rights at the time of the removal, or that the parent would have been exercising their rights if the child hadn't been taken. The convention also has to have been in force between the two countries before the date of when the child was taken to the other country. So in these types of cases, we see this sometimes when two countries are new partners under the convention. A parent who has had their child abducted before the date of when that partnership between the two countries entered into force, they will not be able to pursue the return of their child under the convention because the convention itself is not retroactive. And then the other, the final stipulation is, like I said, that the child has to be under the age of 16.
So just because someone files a case under the convention, I guess, that doesn't necessarily mean that the child will be returned.
No, it doesn't. Like I was explaining before, is that, there's different articles in the convention that allow for exceptions to the return of the child. It could be that there's, a reasonable assumption that it would cause harm to the child to return to their country of habitual residence. Things like this can allow for the child to be ordered to remain in the country with the parent that they're with, as opposed to returning to their country of habitual residence.
So let's say that there's an American citizen and a foreign national, and they have a child together in the United States. The foreign national takes the child to country X, let's just not impugn anybody, the country X, and the left behind parent, what do? Do they file in a U.S. court?
If the countries are partnered under the convention?
Yes.
No, they,
Where is it litigated? Where's the question resolved? Like, who makes the determination, well, yeah, this was in violation of a custody order, but the left behind parent is raging alcoholic, or it's not, the child will be trafficked or something horrible, right? Who makes that determination? Like, what's the legal channels? So
the case is actually heard in the country where the child was taken to. So if the child was taken from the United States to country X's courts would be the ones that are determining whether or not the child should return to the United States or remain in country X. And in order to do that, the parent, they could call my office, the Office of Children's Issues, and we would assist them in providing them with the application. The Hague application is actually, as it sounds, it's an application form. And then there's additional documents that they may need to provide if they have custody orders or divorce decrees, things like this, birth certificates, that they need to provide along with their application. They would submit it to my office. We would review it to make sure all of the proper documents are there. And then we would submit it on to the central authority in the other country, which is basically our counterpart in that country. They would also similarly review it, make sure everything that they need is present. And then depending on the country, they handle it differently. Some countries they would, they would ask if the left behind parent in the United States wants them to reach out to the taking parent to see if the taking parent's willing to come to a voluntary resolution. And sometimes, with impending litigation, a parent may come to a voluntary resolution. They'll agree to come to an agreement with the other parent. Maybe it's returning, maybe it's not, just to resolve it before it gets to court. Sometimes parents don't want to reach out. They don't want the other central authority to reach out to the taking parent to try and resolve it voluntarily. Sometimes that's because they've already tried to do that themselves and they know it's just not going to work. Instances where either the taking parent is not willing to resolve it, or the left behind parent doesn't want the central authority to reach out to them, then the case will be filed in court. Depending on the country, it may be the central authority that files it in court, or it may be the left behind parent along with their attorney in that country who pursue filing it in court. And then it goes through the court system, and they'll have, it could have more than one hearing to try and collect all the evidence that the court needs in order to determine, the final Hague order, whether or not the child is going to return to the United States in this case, or whether the child is going to stay in country X. And then oftentimes after the order is issued, then it comes down to law enforcement in that country to enforce the order. And, some countries are better at that than others. Potentially, then the child would be, the order would be enforced and the child would be returned back to their country of habitual residence.
Do you have any statistics on how many cases where, I don't know if there's any evidence to show how many cases when they go to the court and when this convention is followed, the child actually gets returned versus staying in the country where the case was filed?
Yeah. It varies country to country. Some countries are better at implementing the convention than others. Our office, the Office of Children's Issues, puts out a report every year. It's our annual report on international child abduction. Can be found on our website. And that basically is our venue for evaluating countries on their compliance with the convention. We also evaluate countries that are non-convention countries as to whether or not they are working with us to resolve cases, despite the fact that we don't have the convention as a framework. And so in that report every year, we have the ability to cite a country in the report.
Cite, what does that mean? Penalize?
To cite them is to basically, it's kind of calling them out on saying that they, especially convention countries, that they are non-compliant under the convention for a number of reasons. It could be because their judiciary isn't hearing cases in a prompt or efficient manner. It could be because their law enforcement is not enforcing return orders as they should be. It could be that the central authority is not competent or not processing cases. They're not communicative. There's difficulties there. So there's a number of reasons why we could cite them, and it's a means of kind of calling out countries to point out the issues that we've had with them under the convention. But like I said, we also do it for non-convention countries, and those it's generally whether or not they are willing to work with us to help us resolve cases of children that were taken to their country.
And any countries you want to cite today?
Well, our annual report doesn't come out until it's due out at the end of April every year, and it covers the previous calendar year. So the 2019 report will cover calendar year 2018. For our annual report for 2018, which covered calendar year 2017, came out back in May. Mm-hmm. And we did cite, I believe, 12 or 13 countries, spanning all over the world, different regions. We may see some of those cited again. We may see some new countries cited. We may see some of them fall off the list of cited countries. If they've improved over the last year.
You cited a website. What is your website?
Yes. So it's travel.state.gov. And on there's a whole section on international parental child abductions. That's where parents can find more information on how to contact my office, what to do, if they're afraid that their child is going to be abducted, how to prevent abductions. There's also a variety of resources on how to hire an attorney and also what my office does, what we're able to do in cases and what we aren't able to do. So there's a lot of information on there for parents who have either had their child taken or who are afraid that their child may be taken.
If you're listening and this applies to you and you'd like more information, you can go to travel.state.gov and there's a tab there.
Yes.
Tab there on international parental child abduction.
Yes.
Real Talk USA.
Let's talk a little bit about how the cases are handled. Can you describe a little bit about how international child abduction cases, like from the beginning to the end, like how do they process?
For a non-convention country?
For non-convention countries,
Okay.
yes.
Generally, if a parent reaches out to my office because they've had a child who's taken to a country that is either not a party to the convention or a country that is not partnered with the United States under the convention, what we can do is we can provide them with information and resources. We do not provide them with legal advice, but they can reach out to an attorney either in the United States or in the country their child was taken to. All of our embassies and consulates maintain a list of attorneys who are willing to work with U.S. citizens, so we oftentimes will direct them there if they're interested in hiring an attorney, or at least speaking to an attorney in the country where their child was taken to better understand their legal options in that country. And so what my office does is we generally provide them with resources like these and information, as well as, we kind of monitor their case. So periodically we may reach out to parents to see where things have gone with the case, whether or not maybe they have pursued custody in the country that the child was taken to, and how that's working out, and whether or not there's anything that we can assist with. Outside of our regular consular services, there's not a whole lot more we can do. If the child is going to return to the United States and needs a passport, of course we can work with our colleagues out in country at the embassy or consulate that's nearest to try and get them the passport that they need in order to return, things like that. But most of the time we're just providing them with resources that are already publicly available. And they are the ones that need to take the actions on their own, whether it's filing for custody either in the United States or in the country where the child was taken to, or if it's maybe pursuing criminal charges in the United States, usually as international parental child abduction is a crime in the United States.
So that was going to be my next question. So is it a crime in the countries that we partner with? Is that like a prerequisite? It doesn't have to be. No,
so the convention covers the civil aspects of international parental child abduction, and so they provide for a civil mechanism for a child to be returned to the country of habitual residence.
Civil as opposed to criminal.
Yes. Some countries also criminalize international parental child abduction. The United States is one of them. So in the U.S., this is a crime in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and it's actually also a federal crime under the International Parental Child Kidnapping Crime Act. Not all convention countries see it as a crime. They don't criminalize it. Some non-convention countries do criminalize it. So the two don't necessarily have to go hand in hand, and essentially they don't go hand in hand. They're two very different aspects of these types of cases, because the criminal aspect has implications for the taking parent, but doesn't necessarily have implications for the return of the child. So even if a parent is say in the most extreme of circumstances is extradited from the country they've taken the child to back to the United States, and they're maybe put in jail or something like that for this crime, that doesn't necessarily mean the child is extradited with them. You can't extradite a child. So the child may be left in that country with a grandparent or a family member, and now the left behind parent in the United States is still trying to seek the return of the child. So although criminal remedies can lead to return of the child in certain circumstances, they don't necessarily always do.
That's interesting. I'm a former prosecutor, and it's hard for me to conceptualize it not being a crime. That's such a cultural, for me, it's such a cultural norm for me that how could that not be a criminal act? Yeah.
In many countries, they have a hard time understanding how a parent could abduct a child. We hear that a lot, as especially in Africa and many other countries. They don't understand how a parent, can abduct their child. But essentially, it is possible because, they're now, infringing on the rights of the child to have access to the other parent, as well as the rights of the other parent to have access to the child.
Would I be wrong in guessing that the vast majority of the cases are the fathers abducting their child, vice the mother's abducting the child? Don't.
Yeah,
that
no.
looks very uncomfortable. Like, it's a very
it's fine.
uncomfortable question.
It's fine. No, it's actually it's the other way around. Actually,
Really?
In most parts of the world, we see mothers abducting their children. Usually, they're going back to a country where they're from. So, maybe they're from Ethiopia or they're from India or somewhere, and they're abducting the child back to that country. Maybe they just didn't like living in the United States. Maybe they're having marital issues and they're going back to somewhere that's comfortable to them, and they take their children with them. So we do see fathers abducting their children, but it is much more common to see mothers abducting.
Mez, what do you think about that?
For me, the word abduction itself is kind of weird when you're talking about a parent. Like it's my child too, and so if I take a child away from another parent, when you hear the word abduction, it's like a kidnapper, a criminal taking a child away, and not the parent that's taking that child away from another parent. So it's kind of like we should also sort of say this is actually about just parents taking children away, not about a criminal kidnapping or abducting a child.
Which is probably criminal everywhere. I mean, well, maybe not everywhere,
it's
but
not everywhere. That's what I mean. Like, I think in the Ethiopian context, I totally get what this is about, but it's in my head as an Ethiopian. It's like it's my child. It cannot be abduction if I take my child
so we've
with
got to
me.
keep our eyes on you.
I know. And so, I think it's a cultural thing. And it's even if it's the
You
agree?
Actually,
even if it's the father taking the child. I mean, I can't even bring myself to use the word abduction. I understand that there might be very bitter, for example, divorce cases where the parents cannot live with each other, they cannot see each other, and that puts the child in a very uncomfortable position. But it's, I mean, still in my head, it's just impossible for me to think about a parent taking a child being called an abduction. I've been pretty open with my flaws, right? I'm divorced, right? And I got 2 kids back in the States. When I go back home and I want to take my kids out of where they live, right? I have to make sure that my ex consents. Yes.
Or if they get on an international flight,
Yes.
I have to have a letter from her noting that,
And I think
is that not the case here?
Even when it's not a divorce, like, I mean, parents have to agree when children travel or when they have to take them from one place to another. But I don't know if it's actually that case here. If anyone would check if you're divorced and whatever child you're with and you're traveling internationally, let's say, and I don't know if they have the right travel documents. I don't know if anyone would check if you are authorized to actually take that child with you, regardless of whether you're divorced or not. I just don't know.
Well, and it's actually in the United States, you can, very easily get on a plane with a child. There's no exit controls in the United States. So there's nothing stopping a parent from leaving the country with a child without the other parent's consent.
I think that's insane, by the way. That the United
A lot of
States,
people do.
It's insane.
Yeah, I don't know why we don't implement exit controls, but as of now,
I know South Africa has this very, very strong child thing. Like, if you're going into South Africa with a child, you have to prove that you have documentation that the other parent has agreed that you can travel with this child, that you can go to South Africa with the child and come back out of that country with that child. I know for sure that there are very strict controls in South Africa. I haven't heard of any other country that has as strict rules as South Africa in terms of bringing in as well as taking out a child to and from that country.
I think in our case it's more of a cultural issue than policy. That's why I asked you earlier. It's more of tradition and cultural issue. Even another family member can take a child. I say an uncle, for instance, I can take my niece to like that.
Yeah, in some countries, I find that the issue is not even so much culturally not aligning. It's more the terminology. They don't like the word abduction. Like you said, is that, how can a parent abduct a child? And so I found that in some countries you can even, as long as we can bridge that gap, that terminology gap, we can come to an agreement of what we're talking about, even if we're calling it two different things. And so sometimes we see that.
It's difficult to register. So I can totally understand when someone goes and says, this child is supposed to be with X, but as Y, you have to ensure that X gives you permission to do so. But if Y is another parent of that child, it's just difficult to call it an abduction in Ethiopia. At least in the Ethiopian context, it's very strange.
Yeah, this whole conversation is extremely sad to me. Like I can't imagine something more difficult.
Real Talk USA.
What can a parent do if they think that their child's other parent or relative may take the child to another country? Are there steps that people can take to prevent it? Or?
Yeah, so
report them to TSA.
Yeah, so actually my office has a whole team that works on preventing abductions from the United States to other countries. And they work really closely with law enforcement and airlines in order to...
I was actually right.
to stop abductions that may be in progress. Generally, we encourage parents who are afraid that their children might be taken to consult an attorney in the United States, because one way for a parent to prevent their children from being abducted is to have a custody order. If they have a custody order, law enforcement may be able to enforce that custody order as the other parent is trying to leave the country in violation of that custody order. And so our prevention team does a lot to prevent children from being abducted, especially these abductions in progress. They work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security's Customs and Border Protection to stop abductions in progress. The other program that they have that they mainly handle is the Children's Passport Issuance Alert Program. So in the United States, two-parent consent is required for a passport issuance of a child. And so the Children's Passport Issuance Alert Program, it allows for my office to contact the parent that has enrolled the child in the program to verify whether or not the parental consent requirement for the child's passport issuance has been met. And so one parent may, come into a passport agency with an application. They have a signed, notarized document saying that the other parent had consented, but maybe that other parent has the child enrolled in this program. And so what my office will do is they will proactively reach out to that parent to make sure that they have consented to the issuance of the passport, to make sure that the parental consent documentation is not fraudulent, or even just if since they signed it that they still consent to that passport issuance. So this helps prevent children from getting passports when both parents don't consent. However,
do people use that as a weapon?
In what way?
Do they deny, like a parent just out of spite doesn't let the other one won't consent?
Probably, yeah. I would think so, as a tool of getting back to them to for some wrong they feel like they've been had. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think a lot of parents they just want to make sure that their children aren't leaving the country without their consent. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate thing is, though, that once a child is issued a passport, so say maybe the family is living together, the parents are still married, they obtain a passport for the child, they go on vacation, they come back, and now maybe the mother has the passport and the parents get divorced or separated, and if the mother has the passport, essentially, barring any other, custody order or anything, there's nothing preventing her from leaving the United States with the child on that passport. We can't flag passports. We can't prevent people from traveling on them. So it's a program that does help us prevent children from getting passports, but for children who already have passports, we can't prevent them from traveling on them.
Where can a parent get legal advice?
Parents can reach out to an attorney either in the United States, or they can reach out to an attorney in in the country where their child was taken. As I was saying before, all of our embassies and consulates maintain attorney lists of attorneys who have identified themselves as willing to work with U.S. citizens. And so we can refer them to that list, which is on all of the embassies and consulates' websites. So it's publicly available, and they can, reach out to an attorney themselves and speak with them and determine if they want to retain them to possibly pursue custody or some other court proceedings. Yeah, either in the country that the child was taken to or in the United States.
What if a child has been abducted but hasn't gone internationally?
Yeah, so if a child hasn't gone outside of the country where they're living, the left behind parent can contact the police or the local authorities in their country where they're living. Some law enforcement agencies are less responsive if there's no custody order for the child. And it can also depend on the laws of the country and how family matters are handled in that country. Sometimes, the authorities that handle these types of cases can vary from country to country, and so it really depends on the country you're in.
In the U.S., if there is no court order, custody order, what is is it still abduction?
Yeah, so you can abduct a child within the United States.
Yeah. Without
a custody order?
Custody order is what
I believe so, yes. If you're taking them outside of the state where they're residing.
Mm-hmm. Without the consent of the other parent?
Yeah, without the consent of the other parent, it would be considered a domestic parental child abduction. And, I mean, the good thing with, a child being taken inside the United States is that, the different states can work together in trying to locate the child and trying to determine the correct jurisdiction for the custody proceedings within the United States, depending on which state. Yeah. Exactly. Even though each state has their own court system, we do have, federal laws that allow us to do this.
Well, I imagine that your job has a lot of ups and downs. Has there been a case where you were successfully able to get a child back, and what was that like? What was the feeling like when you were successful?
Yeah, so we get children back from time to time. It's not something that happens every single day, but depending on the countries that we work on, definitely depends on the rate of return. But it is always a nice feeling to get a child returned to the United States. I think the best cases are the ones where the left behind parent follows up with us, and they might take a picture of themselves with the child and they'll send us a photo. Things like that are usually really nice to see that the child has made it back safely and that they're reacclimating to being in the United States and being with the parent that they had been separated from.
Do you have information on the average time of how long it takes for a child to be returned?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So it depends. It depends if the country is a Hague Convention country or not. According to the Hague Convention, cases should be heard promptly in court, and I think it outlines the time frame of 6 weeks, which I don't believe is very common. I think it's pretty rare to see a case from beginning to end within 6 weeks. Even in convention countries, cases can go on for a year or more. It just depends on the circumstances of the case. In non-convention countries, sometimes parents are able to work it out and the child might return very promptly. Sometimes they aren't, and the cases linger for many years. And we continue to work with the parents to assist them in any way we can.
Has there ever been a case you've worked on where the child was abducted when they were a sweet little 6-year-old child, and then they returned as a teenager and the parent wants to give them back?
Not that I can think of.
All right. Well, I'm trying to make light of a terrible situation. As a Marine, my sense of humor is completely shot. We've been speaking with Jennifer Harkins, who is with the Office of Children's Issues for the Hague Abduction Convention. Jennifer, thank you for being on the show. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you'd like to share with our audience? I
don't think so. I mean, I think just if a parent is concerned that their child's going to be taken to or from the United States, feel free to reach out to our office. You can find our contact information on our website, which is as we stated earlier, is travel.state.gov.
And again, if you want to see whether your countries have been or on the naughty or nice list, you can go to travel.state.gov under International Parental Child Abduction. There's a tab on that page where you can find out whether your country complies or whether it has some work to do. Jennifer, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this horrible subject, but I really appreciate you coming on the show today, and good luck, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
It was very informative.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's it for Real Talk this week. We'll chat again next week.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by Afro FM and Chris Meade of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites, www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU, and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.